If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on The More Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new weekly television and radio shows.
All new on The More Show, a first ever TV interview with 3 brave male survivors of sexual abuse. What's it like living all those years and not being able to tell anybody? How did you at the time cope with the rape? How much did you hate your mum at that time?
Hate, it's probably a very light word.
On today's show, I'll be joined by 3 brave male survivors of childhood abuse. These courageous men are here with us today to lift the veil of shame, because what happened to them as young boys has profoundly affected who they have become as men. The topic is taboo and surrounded by shame. It's a silent and devastating epidemic with numbers that are staggering. It's estimated that 1 in every 6 boys is sexually abused before the age of 16. Past abuse in childhood is an uncomfortable issue which many choose to sweep under the carpet. Peter Saunders was first abused at the age of 7 by a close family member. The abuse was conducted by a person Peter looked up to and respected.
I was the youngest of 5. The 4 siblings had come along years before I was born, and I came along and was quite openly referred to as a mistake. And my mum was clearly worn out and not interested. And I think likewise my dad wasn't terribly interested. I mean, I knew that they loved me, but they weren't terribly interested in me. So this other relative kind of stepped into their role and could spot that vulnerability.
Peter was groomed by this close family member who eventually started to abuse him sexually at just 7.
What I remember was just feeling dreadful and feeling this person and his naked body on top of me and doing things to me. I can remember wanting to scream with the feelings of pain and the feelings of being out of control and not knowing what to do, but feeling completely unable to even move as this person was basically yanking at my private parts. But in the morning it was like nothing had happened. It wasn't spoken of. I wasn't treated any differently. This person groomed me. I mean, this was a relative that I really looked up to.
The abuse went on for 7 years by a man whom he trusted and loved. The impact of the abuse lives with Peter up till this day.
I always felt incredibly dirty. I always felt contaminated. And I had, from when the abuse started, I had an obsession with needing to wash. I can still remember him because he tended to suffer from a body odour that still remains in my sort of subconscious even to this day.
Peter is here with us today to share his story. Now, Peter, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Kevin.
That was a very powerful video that we just watched there. And with yourself then, I mean, who did you tell initially about the abuse?
I didn't tell a soul about the abuse until I was getting on for 40 years of age, Kevin, which I think is quite common amongst survivors of abuse, that they keep the crime secret for that long. And the first people I actually did disclose the abuse to were work colleagues.
And what was that like when you first told the work colleagues? I mean, what was the reaction?
The reaction was, I suppose you'd say almost disbelief. These were people I'd worked alongside for a few years, and they would never have known anything about my childhood. Why would they? And then when my father was dying and my father died, I just felt the urge that I needed to talk to somebody about what had happened to me, because I was never able to talk to my dad, unfortunately. And when he died, it was obviously too late. And that was when I kind of blurted out that I'd been abused. And then once I blurted it out once, it just kept coming. And subsequently went to the press, the police, amongst others, and pretty much told the world what had happened to me.
And why do you think you couldn't have come forward to your mother?
I never really had a relationship with my parents, and my sort of primary abuser, if you like, was more like a surrogate parent to me. So it was a situation where I didn't have anybody to turn to, and my mum and dad were probably the last people that I would have felt able to turn to. And as I say, many years later, as Dad lay dying, I realised I needed to sort things out.
So that was kind of like an emotional release when Dad went, that you had to. It was a trigger in a sense, wasn't it?
It was a trigger, and I think it was a kind of a slight feeling of liberation as well, because my dad had always been an object of fear to me, having been brought up in a very strict household with lots of physical punishment and stuff. So I was never able to really communicate with my dad. And as he lay dying, I never told him about the abuse because it was too late. But as he lay dying, I realised that I needed to do something, and I needed to spill the beans and to tell the world about the perpetrators.
What was
as
it
well.
like living all those years and not being able to tell anybody, especially your wife as well?
Well, I mean, my first wife never even, I was married for 12 years, and I never even told her. The mother of my children never knew about the abuse that I suffered. So I think in common with many survivors, we just basically bury the issue, lead a life.
But you say buried, but I mean, it must have been coming up in the surface a lot. I mean, did it come up in your past relationships in a sense?
I think that the consequences of the abuse surface all the time in terms of things like lacking in trust. I never trusted anybody. Feeling depressed and down and low self-esteem, all these things, again, in common with most other survivors, was just my life experience. It wasn't, as I say, until my dad was dying that the enormity of what, and my own children were at a similar age that I was at when I was abused.
That must have been difficult. Yeah.
It all conspired to mean I needed to speak out, because you know, some of the abusers, and my main abuser was still very much a part of our family and a danger to children. So
what happened then, eventually, once you've told your work colleagues, your family must have found out as well pretty soon after?
I told my family. It was a very difficult time. Dad had just died. My family couldn't quite understand why I was, to quote them, bringing this up at this painful time, to which my response was, well, if not now, when? And our family relationships, my relationship with my family since then has been very difficult. And I can understand that, because it must be awful to suddenly be told by your kid baby brother things that happened to him all those years ago, because what can they do about it now? I can understand their situation.
But your brother, your younger brother, am I right, went to the same school?
My older brother.
So your older brother, went to the same school?
My older brother went to the same school that I attended 6 years before me, and he was also sexually abused by one of the priests who subsequently sexually assaulted me when I was a pupil there, as I say, 6 years later. And my brother never disclosed his abuse until I disclosed mine.
Wow. And have you spoke to your brother since? I mean, are your brother
I was very close to my brother Mike. He's now dead. The alcoholism that set in with him when he was still at school, and the drugs that he went on to when he was still at school, eventually killed him. And so Mike's no longer around.
So why don't you think you went down that path? What stopped you from getting onto drugs and drink?
Possibly my faith. I say I've always had a strong faith, a very personal thing. But my life hasn't been all roses.
No.
And I've struggled with drink over the years. Many survivors will tell you that they struggle or use various things as kind of crutches to get through life. So in many ways I consider myself fortunate that I've got through my life so far, when many don't.
And do you blame yourself? Have you stopped that part?
I have to say I don't blame myself anymore, but again, in common with many people who talk to charities like the one I work for, we tend to grow up thinking that somehow it was our fault, somehow that we brought the abuse on, that somehow we are bad and deserved maybe what happened. Or as a young child, it was, I just thought this is what happened to you as a child. Yeah. And it's only in later life that you realise how devastatingly wrong it was.
And that's so common. That theme is so common. I've heard that so many times. And the most important thing you did, no matter what age it was, is to talk about it. Do you wish that you had spoken earlier?
Well, of course I do. I wished I could have spoken when I was 7. And thank goodness these days, hopefully things are starting to change. And children, hopefully, will be given the opportunity to speak out if things are going wrong for them. But we know that abuse is still a massive epidemic around the world. But yes, of course I wished I could have spoken earlier, but I don't think I could have done. I didn't have the words, and I think what is different about today is that at long last we are talking about this nasty, evil crime. And I think that's the best thing that we can do, because it certainly helps survivors to know that they're not alone, but more importantly, it's helping to protect our children and tomorrow's children.
Well, it's a very taboo subject, isn't it?
It is a very taboo subject, absolutely. And one of the most uncomfortable things that we have to consider is, you quoted the figures about the number of boys that have suffered sexual abuse before the age of 16. Think if you add the equation in with girls that have been abused, we're talking about huge, huge numbers. Probably well over 1 billion people around the world have suffered abuse. But think about how many abusers there are in society as well. And they don't want us discussing this issue, Kevin.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Okay, we'll be right back after this short break. After the break, Graham Wilmer speaks out about his abuse by his teacher. How did you, at the time, cope with the rape?
Visit themoreshow.co.uk/shop to purchase products and services from your favourite past guests. If you're new to this site, you can also catch up on the previous television and radio shows through YouTube and the More Show website.
Welcome back. Now, Graham was a promising student in a Catholic school when a new chemistry teacher was transferred and offered extra tuition to Graham. His parents thought it was a great idea. The teacher quickly befriended him and eventually abused him sexually at just 13 years old.
After about 2 or 3 lessons, he seemed to sort of single me out for attention, and he befriended me very quickly. He just reached out his hand and put his hand on my penis and began to rub it. But he was still smiling and talking to me and joking about it and saying, this is what boys do, this is what men do, so it's okay, there's no need to be frightened. And then he took my hand and put it on his penis and sort of made me rub it.
Graham was abused as often as 3 times a week. His teacher even started to threaten him and said it was their own little secret.
In the early part of this period, he used to tell me that I was a homosexual and that he was a homosexual, and that's what homosexuals did. The biggest threat he used was that he'd commit suicide, and he'd leave a note to say that I was going to tell these terrible lies about him and he couldn't face that. So I would be the one who'd be left with everybody saying, how dare you, how dare you.
As a way of coping with the abuse that was taking place, Graham decided to ask his teacher to start paying him to maintain his silence.
He loved it because suddenly he thought I was now being compliant. I was now fully engaged in this process, and that he didn't have to threaten me anymore. All he had to do was pay me. The amount was £1. And I said, if this would say be on a Tuesday. I said, if you give me £1, you can pay me on Friday. Well, at the time, it was a great relief, because it often meant that there would be several days without this abuse taking place. So I could at least, have time to build up towards it.
After 6 months, the abuse escalated to another level when his teacher would take him on holidays, sometimes for as long as 2 weeks, during which time he was raped. Graham clearly recalls the first time that it happened.
He made me undress. He laid me down on my front on this settee that he'd made, and he raped me. I felt so trapped that the only way out for me was to die, but I didn't know how to die. I didn't know how would I actually bring my life to an end. But if I had have been able to think about how I would do it, I would have done it.
The abuse has tormented Graham for the past 40 years, but he sits here today as a free man. Wow, Graham, welcome to the show. I mean,
thanks, Kevin. Good to be here.
Thank you. I mean, watching that video, how does that make you feel?
Well, I try hard, like most survivors, to be beyond this. And as you know, lots of the work I do working with other survivors, like Peter before me.
Yeah.
We often spend most of our time dealing with other people's traumas. But at night, it comes back, and obviously when I see things like that, I am reminded that it wasn't 40 years ago, it was yesterday.
It feels like that.
It feels like that.
Yeah.
But I'm older now. I was a child then, and I saw everything as a child. But I'm older now, I'm stronger, and by being able to be here and talk to people like you who finally are beginning to listen to what we have to say, I know that whilst I can't change what happened to me, maybe through the work that we're doing, I know I can certainly help other men and women who've been through the same experience. But as Peter said also, it's really important to think about the children, because whilst we talk now, even you're talking to me as an adult, all the people that we work with as adults, they have children, and their children will have children. And part of what we do, a large part of what we do, which is what I've tried to do with myself in my own recovery, is be the strong father to my children. I don't want them to have to live with a broken dad. And most of the people that we work with, when we start working with them, they're broken dads.
Well, that's an interesting part, because you're a family man.
Yep.
Yep. And how has this affected your family? Has it helped to have come out and eventually told your story?
Well, it has. I mean, it was terrifying to begin with, because I didn't really plan to tell anybody what had happened, but I had a breakdown which was triggered by the departure of my son going to university, and my breakdown was rapid and disastrous, and suddenly the father provider that had been even though my mask, which I'd worn for many years, were supported by alcohol and drugs and dangerous behaviours, but I managed to protect them from a lot of that. But suddenly my mask fell off, and I was the damaged, broken Graham again.
So in all sorts of departments, even jobs were a problem, keeping jobs?
Jobs were a nightmare. I've run away from things all of my life until finally, when the breakdown came, then that was it. And I was able to start looking at myself again, but it was almost from above, looking down at this broken man. I didn't want to be that broken man. I wanted to be able to support my kids. I wanted to be someone that they could be proud of.
Sure.
But also I wanted to be someone that I could be proud of, and I'd never been proud of me before. I was dirty, and I was well, as you saw in the videotape, for years I'd struggled with the fact that I sold myself to my abuser. But at the time, as a child, I thought that was a great idea, to buy myself some safety for a few days at a time.
Do you think it killed the potential person that you could have been from what happened to you?
Well, the big question, isn't it? We never know who we're going to be, and some of us get run over by buses and we never find out. What I have developed into, like many of the survivors that I work with who do go on to recover, We are damaged, but we're not necessarily destroyed. And part of the work that we've tried to do with so many people is to make them understand that your abuse was part of you, but you are also a whole person, and then that you have creative skills, you're a wonderful human being. So, you know, it might have changed, well, it certainly changed the direction that I might have gone in, but it took me down a different route.
Were you able to eventually track down your abuser, and were they charged?
I did eventually track down my abuser. It came out of the therapy I had when I was in my initial recovery. And they decided that it was an important part of my recovery to try and validate what had happened. So we tracked him down, and that was the bit, of course, where I suddenly had to tell my children, because once I'd said what had happened in a formal environment, the police got involved. And they started looking, they went and found him, they arrested him, and all of a sudden we were going towards a court, a public hearing. Yeah. So I wasn't going to let my children learn about this by reading the local paper, so I had to tell them. That was pretty tough.
I mean, how did you, at the time, cope with the rape? What was your coping mechanism?
At the time, I don't think it was me. You know, all that was happening was something which was very painful. The thing that I remember most about that, and that's the thing that has haunted me for so many years, was the sheer terror. I talked about wanting to die. Yeah. That, to me, the world had closed right down to this tiny little room in this derelict cottage, with a fire burning in the grate, and these things were happening to me. And all I could think about was, I can't get out. You know, I used the word trapped. It was so, the rest of the world was gone. Yeah. And that's the thing, that fear has stayed with me for so many years afterwards. And it comes out, you talked earlier about jobs. Yes. When anybody ever challenged me in a job, I was right back there. It was slightly different, but it was the same feeling of, I need to run away.
Had you ever left that scene? Had you ever left that house, in a sense? Was part of you still there?
It was, until my son left to go to university, and he took with me the child that I'd tried to protect for all these years. And it wasn't until finally one therapist actually said to me, Graham, for Christ's sake, you know, you are the child. There is no child in there. It's you. You're strong now. You don't need to look after a child. You are the child. Look after yourself. And that, it almost disappeared in a puff of logic.
Like a sense of self-love in a way, yeah.
You know, love yourself.
Love yourself.
Love yourself. Nothing wrong with that.
And how has your life changed now that you've, you know, was it 10 years ago that you spoke? You came out to tell your story.
Yeah, about 10 years ago.
Yeah. And how have you since then changed as a person?
Well, I've stopped drinking as much. I've changed as a person now because at last, and well, for the last 5 years certainly, I've got over a lot of the problems that I struggled with, and I now can actually look myself in the mirror and say, I'm proud to be me. Yeah. Even though, you know, I still recognise that I have a deep scar running through me, but it's part of me. It's not all of me.
Well, it's interesting because off camera I gave you a hug when I first met you. And now that wouldn't have been something you could have done before, would it, to give another man a hug?
For many years, any man who's come near me has been a serious threat to me, and I've run away, physically run away from environments where suddenly there's a group of men walking towards me. I had to have a special bit of cognitive behavioural therapy because it got so bad that I used to step in the street when two men would be walking towards me because I thought they were going to attack me. But you know, in streets you have cars. I'd never think about it. I just step in the street. That's madness, you know, to have that level of fear. And of course, most of these men weren't going to attack me anyway, but that's not how it felt. No. But now, you know, I once again enjoy the company of men, and they don't frighten me anymore.
Well, you know, it is an honour and a pleasure to have you here. So thank you for joining us today and coming on the show.
Thank you for having us.
We'll be back after the break. After the break, a first ever exclusive TV interview with Joe Peters, #1 best-selling author of Cry Silent Tears. A horrific story where Joe was locked in a dog cellar by his own mother for 4 years.
Scared is an understatement. I was threatened to be killed.
How much did you hate your mum at that time?
Hate, it's probably a very light word.
Visit themoreshow.co.uk/shop to purchase products and services from your favourite past guests. If you're new to this site, you can also catch up on the previous television and radio shows through YouTube and the More Show website.
Welcome back. Joe Peter's abuse started at age 5 when his mother found out that Joe's father was having an affair with her best friend. Joe's mother would physically abuse him to get her revenge, but he trusted his beloved father to protect him from the violence. However, when an accident saw his father burned to death in front of him, Joe was left at the mercy of his mother.
She did everything possible to get her revenge, and it never stopped from the day he died. She had the satisfaction of torturing me, and it got to a point where she couldn't bear to look at me. So the only solution was to put me down to a dark cellar.
Joe was kept in a dog cellar for the next 4 years, with only a dirty mattress and a bucket. Nobody even knew of his existence.
I was abused terribly, kicked, punched, tied to the pipes, rapidly beaten by my brothers. I was given scraps to be fed on, a dog bowl. My teeth deteriorated. It got so bad that they glued the top on some water, and my teeth would snap with me trying to take the lid off this bottle they glued together. I was treated unbelievable, worse than a dog could be treated. I wasn't allowed to leave that cellar. I was there, you know, I never bathed or nothing.
He was sometimes left naked in the dark for 3 days without human contact. The only time when Joe was allowed out of the cellar was for his brothers to torture him as his alcoholic mother would watch.
It was an enjoyment thing for my mother, it was entertainment. I remember the faces and aggressiveness. I remember when they put me in between 2 chairs and tied me, and they beat me with a cane until I bled. And then I was sold to pedophiles then. You know, they used to make me touch their private areas. They would physically try and penetrate me from behind. It was absolutely unbearable. They would come down and just choose me as and when they wanted to. She got to a point where my mother was paid as well, and the more she was paid, the more was forced to do these things with different men.
Joe recalled his worst abuse when he was repeatedly raped by his stepfather, as his mother witnessed the scene with seeming enjoyment.
I refused his advances, and he bounced my head against the walls until I passed out. And then the next thing I realised, he penetrated me and then tied me, and for hours and hours, he went on for hours. I was demoralised. He was a horrible, horrible man. I would have to do these things to get fed. So, you know, it was a survival thing. I behave, I would get fed. I come close to dying many times. I was very thin. Had headaches. I was vomiting. It came to a stage where so many times I've seen the light of death, and I wanted so many times to die, and it came to a point where I had to hang on. There was a voice in my head, maybe my father, saying, "Hang on, son, hang on in there."
At 14 years old, Joe found the courage to run away from home and started rebuilding his life. Joe,
Hi.
it's an honour to have you on the show.
Thank you
It
very
really
much.
is, my friend. I would say, I mean, all abuse is bad, and I would say that as levels, that's got to be one of the most severe levels of abuse I've come across.
On many occasions, I've been told it's probably documented as one of the worst. But abuse is abuse. I don't see my abuse any particular in a way of any better than anyone else's or worse than anyone else's. You know, abuse is abuse, regardless what level it comes. You know.
So, tell us the story then. I mean, let's go from there. And how do you get out of that house? What happened? Who rescued you?
Well, it came to a light that I existed for a start when I was about 9, and my younger brother started talking about me in school, and they said, "How old is your brother?" "Oh, he's only a year older than me," and they realised, "Oh, what school does he go to?" Well, my brother instantly said, "Well, he doesn't go to school. He's not allowed to go. He's a naughty boy. He's not allowed." Obviously, the school was very concerned and then called in the child protection team to say, "Look, we've got a boy here who doesn't go to school. Yeah. You know, he stays at home." But at that time, my brother realised he'd said too much, and he certainly got an hiding for it anyway, because there was a knock on the door, and before she knew it was child protection.
How much did you hate your mum at that time?
Hate, it's probably a very light word to use. I detested her in every way possible. It came to a stage where I personally just couldn't look at her, just could not bear to look at her.
But you couldn't talk at the time, is this right?
I was mute. I was mute for a good 5 years after they witnessed my father's death in front of me. Struck me mute. I could barely gag a word. If I wanted something, I'd done something. Especially after I witnessed his death, it was and that's all you could get out of me. So a lot of the abuse went on, and they could get away with it because I couldn't speak up for myself. So
what age were you when you eventually ran away?
About 13, 14 originally, but I was dragged back to the care home and then sent back to my abusers. So it all happened again. It was a constant circle of abuse.
Gosh, you actually got sent back?
Absolutely, on 3 occasions. I remember once they dragged me out of bed at 10 o'clock. Key workers, which they were called then, bungled in a van and taken home and given back straight in the hands of my mother, who happens that evening when they forced me back home, she was drunk, and they left me with a mother that was drunk.
And the abuse just repeated again?
Again and again. It just was one circle.
Did you think that's what mums did?
Yes, it was perfectly normal for me. It was. I thought at the stage that was all perfectly normal, you know.
And there was no one to talk to?
No.
There was no one you could communicate with?
Just me in the 4 walls. And I would make conversation with my father in spirit, and, you know, in my head.
You felt he was around?
Yeah. So we would have conversations in my head, and I think the images of the good times with my father kept me going. Yeah. Because I repeated those good times in my head, but I also had the images of his accident, which was traumatic as well. And
again, the abuse from the stepbrothers as well, in the same house?
Absolutely. It was ridiculous. The amount of times it went on and on and on, it was unreal.
What point did you run away then, and you'd run away for good?
It was. I got friendly with a chap in school, in secondary school now. I only managed to do a year and a half maybe of junior school, and I befriended a friend called Peter, and he said, "Why don't you just run away and get away from it all, you know?" And that was put in my head, and that's exactly what I did.
So at what point did you learn to talk again then?
That came really about when I was about 12 and a half, 13, right. You know. I had a mental age of a 6-year-old at that age. I couldn't read, write, so it was really bad. So communication was a big problem for me, and I was bullied a lot at school because, look at that daft bugger, he can't even speak, he can't string 2 words together, you know.
Do you wish at that point that you could have told someone of what was going on back at home, or were you just too scared?
I think it was scared is an understatement. I was threatened to be killed, simple as that I would get killed, and you know, and I was buried. I was told on numerous times that that's what would happen to me. You know, I'd be I'd die like my father. They'd light me, set me alight, kill me and bury me. And that thought in my head was enough to keep my silence.
And the control as well.
Oh, controlling.
Ultimate control.
My mother controlled everything. She had multiple personalities. She had schizophrenia. She had, at one stage, when people come to the door like child protection,
Yes.
she'd be able to put on the loving, caring Mother Act, but behind the doors, it was a different kettle of fish.
So, eventually you ended up in London when you ran away
I
for
did
the
indeed.
final time.
Mm-hmm.
And you got into a life of crime.
Life of crime, I was sexually abused and sold on the street as well. It happens, that's the sort of thing it ended up. I was the youngest man to be put in prison at the age of 16 and a half.
Could you keep up with that at the time?
I couldn't, and at that same time as well, I had met a nice young lady who was homeless as well, and she was pregnant and she lost a baby, and I got to find out about that when I was in prison. It was absolutely devastating. I was in a maximum category A prison, and I shouldn't have been there, you know.
Where was the key change for you? When did you have that, as Peter and Graham have said, that sort of emotional trigger to say you needed to tell someone what had happened?
Believe it or not, when I first started, it was actually a Crown prosecution lady who was prosecuting me. My legal team walked out and said, "Look, we just can't represent you no more, Joe. You're in so much severe trouble. You've smashed so many shops' windows. You've stole so many stuff. You're going down for 3 or 4 years, and there's nothing we can do. You're a ringleader." And I broke down. They walked out, and the judge wasn't happy. And the prosecutor said, "Look, what's going on with you?" And I told her the full story. And she wept in the cell with me, and she said, "Look, I'll go back to the judge and say, look, see if I can represent you both. It's not heard of. If I can represent you both in defence and prosecution." She did a better job defending than she did prosecuting, because of that, I walked out.
After, all these years and everything, and, I mean, every read your books as well, Cry Myself to Sleep and Cry Silent Tears. I mean, from all the gang rape that you went through, and there were pedophile videos made of yourself.
Absolutely.
After all this process of what you've gone through and finding your perpetrators as well.
Yep.
Where are you now?
I've got to a point where, I'm taking antidepressants, and it never goes away. It will never leave me until the day I die. It'll be with me. But you've got to put that aside.
Yes.
Because if you don't, it'll draw your life. And in my younger years, it was drugs, it was alcohol, and that was keeping me going. And it got to a stage where I thought, you need to pull yourself together, And I come across a lot of inspirational people in my life that sort of like grabbed me back and put me on the right path, And when I met my my wife at the time,
yes.
It's sort of all the criminal activity had stopped.
Did you find that writing these books, and as other guests have come on, they've done the same as well, that writing the books and your memoirs, that's helped you as a sort of recovery process?
I mean, with the first book, Cry Silent Tears, I didn't really wanted it published. It was the therapeutic reasons that I actually wrote that book. But the material in it was so powerful that, at the time, my psychologist and psychiatrist, both of them come together and said, "Look, you need to publish this book. It's one hell of a powerful teaching tool and making people aware of abuse."
Yeah.
So... so it's an awareness. It was so in the end that I agreed to it to be published.
And this has helped you along your path.
Absolutely. It closes. Yeah. I feel that it's a chapter closed in my life, and that's how it's going to stay.
Okay. Well, thank you for being so brave and just telling us your story there.
Thank you very much.
Stay tuned, and we'll be back with these courageous men.
Visit themoreshow.co.uk/shop to purchase products and services from your favourite past guests. If you're new to this site, you can also catch up on the previous television and radio shows through YouTube and the More Show website.
Welcome back. Childhood abuse not only impacts the victims at that time, but leaves a scar that lasts for a lifetime. 3 of these courageous men now join me. Welcome back, guys.
Thank you, Kevin.
Now, this part of the show, I really want to focus on prevention. Now, Peter, your organisation that you set up as you went through your process of recovery was NAPAC, was it not? And so just tell us a bit about NAPAC briefly.
Well, NAPAC is the National Association for People Abused in Childhood. I think we're the only charity of our kind in the UK. We run a national free phone support line for adult survivors of child abuse, any form of child abuse. And every week we're called by between 200 and 1,000 people who tell us about the abuse they suffered, often many decades before. So it's a crime that is often buried and kept a secret for a long, long time. And I think the value of what we're doing today, talking about it, is actually incredible, because that is what is going to help to protect children in the future.
Again, it's not talked about enough, is it? I mean, Graham, with what you do now and the work that you help people with that are going through abuse, or have been through abuse, shall I say, just explain your projects up in Liverpool.
We set up a project 10 years ago called the Lantern Project, and we were initially trying to support ourselves. It was a male survivors group, small group of men, that we'd been part of a wider group in Liverpool, in Merseyside, as a result of Operation Care, which was a big police operation that looked at abuse across the whole region of Merseyside. And when that finished, a group of us got together and said, we need to keep this going to support each other. Once we'd started working in support of ourselves, if you like, we realised the lack of support that was available to deal with many of the questions that we still had left. So we decided we'd try and do something about that. That project has now grown. In the last 10 years, we've worked face to face with over 2,000 survivors in prisons all over the northwest region. And we've developed our own therapeutic model that involves all of the GP practices and all of the drug and alcohol teams, the police, the probation service. And we actually put a complete team of support around individual survivors now. And the figures that Peter's just given you are quite staggering.
Amazing.
We get about 12 referrals a day from our local area, and it just never stops coming.
There's always someone coming through your door, isn't there?
They never stop.
And one thing I liked about your work as well is that on some of the survivors, you get them to write down what happened to them. And as we, as Joe explained earlier on, how important that process was for him.
We found, in fact, through my own therapeutics recovery process, if you like, I found that writing down what happened to me and sticking it up in people's faces and saying, this was a secret you wanted me to hold, it's no longer a secret. Instead of them becoming all frustrated and angry, they run away from it. They don't like the truth. So we've learned that if you help people disclose in the right way, and you can't just say, write a book, it has to be appropriate for them. But certainly the therapeutic benefit of some people being able to unburden themselves in the written word, not necessarily for publication, but as Joe said, originally that was part of his. It is actually it really does get some of this stuff out and onto the table. And it has a life form of its own.
Absolutely, and as we speak about prevention, Joe, as well. Abusers, in a sense, they never seem to be strangers, do they?
No, they're usually people who the child knows, mother, father, uncle, teacher. It's usually people who are really close to the child,
Yeah. And with your own work that you do, just explain a bit about what you do as well and preventions that you're putting in place.
We're currently undertaking an awareness campaign to educate parents, teachers and so forth. So we're hitting the road with a 2012 awareness campaign to show the signs of a child abuse and to identify those children much quicker.
So what would you say are some of the signs then?
A lot of the signs is a child. It could vary really. It could be from thumb sucking, withdrawn, a child being withdrawn in school, not communicating. There's a range of reasons why.
But then,
Child
Peter,
should be withdrawn.
that's interesting what Joe's saying there with the withdrawal symptoms. But would you say, Peter, that schools are doing enough though to sort of recognise these signs? I mean, do schools do enough to sort of stamp out sexual abuse or any abuse with children?
I don't think society, from the government downwards, does enough to address this very, very serious issue. And I think the whole of society needs to understand things about the signs and symptoms. I mean, as Joe rightly said, there are things we need to look out for. And because a child is behaving in a particular way doesn't necessarily mean that they are being abused.
Yeah.
But we need to raise awareness so that if there is a whole set of signs and symptoms, there should be a caring adult in that child's life that child can turn to get some help. And it appalls me that we've had these big child protection charities around for a long, long time, and we haven't done enough to protect our children.
As a current example of what Peter's just said about the lack of interest from the government downwards, I mean, about 3 weeks ago we wrote to the Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove, and asked him to investigate historical child abuse within a large Catholic group of schools in England and Wales, which was where I was abused in one of those schools, because we've had dozens of disclosures of boys who've been abused in those same schools since I first published my story. His reply, which came to us 2 days ago, was very sorry to hear about what happened to you, but these things happened a long time ago, and therefore the government is not minded to investigate. I mean, where do you go with that? This is the man who was responsible for the education and safety of children in schools, full stop. It's a long time ago, so therefore it's probably not happening now. You're wrong, Mr. Gove. It's happening right now.
Yeah. I mean, what angers you, Joe, about all the abuse that goes on day in, day out?
I'll be totally honest with you. It needs to be certainly addressed. It angers me because, this government, like you say, with these fellas, it's not being addressed. We're constantly being kicked back. I wanted a monitoring programme in place, which I put forward to MPs to put forward to Parliament.
Yes.
Totally rejected. And I thought it was an ideal programme to identify these children. And that what angers me is because they're just, everything you put forward and suggest to them, it's all down to money. It's money. Money is an issue.
Well, you'd have thought they'd care that that childhood is so important that they want to raise stable future generation. Well, that's going to be a little bit difficult if we're not tackling some of these more difficult taboo subjects.
Sorry, I was going to say I agree with you, and I think one of the biggest problems that we have to tackle is not just the complacency about it, but there are too many people in positions of power and authority in this country who are themselves abusers, and they do not want this to come out because it will put a spotlight on them. And wherever you go, in every strata of society, in every organisation, whether it's Parliament, the local school, there are people who are abusers, and they do not want abuse survivors to have a voice, because as I say, it shines a light on their murky world.
And if one person that's watching this show, Graham, that's going through abuse and remains silent yet wants some help, what would be your first recommendation?
You need to talk to somebody that's safe. Now, obviously, in the geographical area that we work in, people are now beginning to talk to us.
Of course.
We're a much smaller organisation than Peter's organisation. The sort of things that Joe are doing as well. There are places where people can go. If it's a child who's being abused, obviously they're probably not watching this show now, but if they were, for example, they should go and talk to somebody in their school. Not all teachers are abusers like mine was. The majority of them are perfectly safe and good people. So go to your school. Don't go to your parents first.
And I will say this as well. We're not here to vilify the pedophiles, but we are here to say that there is help out there, isn't there, for everyone? Yeah. I mean, there has to be systems and recovery programs in place, and I don't think they're there neither, from what I'm hearing from yourselves. Properly.
Kevin, there are actually more systems in place and help in place for perpetrators than there are for victims.
Absolutely.
None of us here as abuse survivors would question the fact that we need to work with offenders that we catch.
Because we've got to keep children safe.
But where we all struggle, and I know with our respective organisations, we get peanuts in terms of funding, whereas, as I say, the perpetrators have a whole package of support that goes with them, and that needs to change. Yes, we need to do that, but we also need to support the victims and help them to move on.
Yeah, and Joe, sort of one message out there to the audience, in the sense of, you know, if someone is, like I asked Graham, going through abuse, what would be your advice as well?
Do you know what? It's quite easy to close down and not tell anyone about the abuse, but they need to open up. Without them being open, trust a friend, even a best mate at school or a best friend's parent. There's plenty of people there that can help. And also, if so, visit my website. There's help there. We can advise a child where to get the help.
And we'll put that on our website as well.
And we don't just deal with children, we also deal with adults as well, and we do a lot of referrals. Unfortunately, we refer a lot to yourselves, NAPAC, adults. But yes, speak up and trust an adult that they're close to.
And I love the way that you're all working together, and I mean, that's the only way forward, isn't it, as well, to be together.
It is. I mean, one of the
page.
things that I've often said to people when they say, how on earth are we going to get our voices heard? And I said, well, you know, if I'm standing here in a small boat in the middle of a hurricane, I can shout as loud as I like, not many people are going to hear me. But if we all shout together, eventually the hurricane will stop, and we'll still be shouting. People will hear us.
Well, it's amazing just to be here with you, and I just want to thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you for giving us the time.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. For more information on today's show, visit my website, themoreshow.co.uk. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on the shows. So thanks for watching. Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Kevin.
you. Don't forget, you can also hear The More Show Late Night Talk on various FM stations across the UK. Check The More Show website for station listings.
If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on The More Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new weekly television and radio shows.